Well, good morning and welcome. If you're a guest here, we apologize for our... no, we don't apologize for our construction. Apologize for the inconvenience, I guess we'll put it that way. But we're excited about what God's doing and the progress that has been made, and we thank God for that. If you would take your Bibles and open to Daniel chapter 3 this morning. We're continuing the book of Daniel today. You know, if you ever went to Sunday school, you've probably heard this story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Or if you watched Veggie Tales as you were growing up, it was Rack, Shack, and Benny, right? Our kids used to do that. And so it's about, we talked about Daniel the last few weeks, a young boy in Babylon. He's carried off into a strange country. He'd been tested. Last week we saw how God had used him to interpret the king's dream. And he saves the wise men from being executed. So now we are probably about 15 years later. And Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are now serving in the king's cabinet. Now, if you've got your notes there with you, you notice I got a lot of ground to cover this morning. We're going to look at 4 similarities to today, 4 things you need to do when the heat is on, 3 ways God will help in times of crisis, and 5 things God does when I'm in the fire. And all those things come right out of this chapter in Daniel chapter 3. Now, Daniel may have been out of town when this was happening. It doesn't say where Daniel was at. He writes the story about his 3 friends, but he may have been, he was working in the king's cabinet, so he may have been an ambassador to another country, a foreign land. Babylon at that time was the world superpower of that day, so they covered a lot of territory. And so he may have been in another territory at the time. It doesn't sound like he was actually there when this happened, but his 3 friends were. And so he tells the story about his 3 friends. So let's start reading the first several verses here in Daniel chapter 3. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, 60 cubits, just to put that in perspective, that's like 90 feet tall, okay? And 6 cubits wide, about 9 feet wide. So this is a huge statue, 90 feet tall. And I don't know how tall this ceiling is. What is that, about 25, 30 feet maybe? So let's just figure 3 times that tall. That's how tall this statue was out there in this plain. And made of gold. That's a lot of gold. A lot of gold, just to put that in perspective. It says, he then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, and advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Okay, let's hang on for just a little bit. What's going on? Well, there's a big festival going on. All the people from the places that Nebuchadnezzar ruled were there. And he says anybody who doesn't worship him would be thrown into this furnace. And what probably was the furnace that they'd used to make this image, where they used to maybe melt down the gold. And when I think of something like that, I got to think of my father-in-law, who was a farrier for 40-some years, shot horses, and he had this forge in his workshop where he could heat up metal, and he could later in years he used a gas forge, but originally he had a coal forge. And you put coal in there and you had this deal that you would step on, or you would pump a handle, and it would blow air into that thing and make it super hot. And you could put metal into this forge, and it would make it red hot, so you could work the metal easily. It was that type of a thing, that type of a furnace that got super hot. It wasn't like your fireplace. It's much hotter than that. And it was that type of a furnace. Now, the text here doesn't tell us what this image looked like, but I would guess it was an image of Nebuchadnezzar himself. Why would I say that? Because people in power tend to think very highly of themselves. And we know that Nebuchadnezzar had this pride complex going on, didn't he? Someone has said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think we can see that in Nebuchadnezzar as we look at the different events in his life, that he had that kind of a complex, that he had this power and it went to his head, and so he built this image, and it was probably of himself. Everybody worshiped this image of myself. Does that ever happen today? Do people, in power have that kind of a complex today? And, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent for just a little bit, okay? Probably the most powerful person in the world today. He speaks and the whole world bows to his every whim and wish. The news media worships him. He's the highest paid official in the United States government today. He's probably the most powerful person in our government today is Dr. Fauci. Okay? It's become very clear over the last week or so with the release of some emails that Dr. Fauci was funding this lab in China that created the virus that has killed over 30 million people. Why would they do that? What they call gain-of-function research on viruses, making them more contagious and more deadly than they are in their natural state? Why would they do that? I don't know why we would do that. But it's become clear by the emails from Dr. Fauci himself that he knew where this came from and lied about it, said, it's just natural, and put that out there. The other day I saw when he was confronted about it, said this. He said, when people attack me, they're attacking science and they are attacking the truth. In other words, I am science and I am the truth, and how dare you little people question my integrity? Never mind that 30 million people have died because of a virus that the people he was paying created. Now I'm going to get off my tangent, all right? Let's look at 4 similarities to today. 4 similarities to today. Number 1, the world creates images for me to worship. Now, we might not create 90-foot tall images, but they're just as real, they're just as distracting, they're on the movie screens, they're at the latest music star, you go to a rock concert, people worship these people, athletes, you go to sporting events, sporting arena, people worship these people. Then there's politicians and, whatever the latest new fad is. Anything you adore above God is your idol. Satan is the god of this world, and he'll do absolutely anything to get you to worship something besides the true God, besides the creator of the universe. So the world creates images for me to worship. The second thing, we create false images of ourselves to impress others. We all have the desire to be loved, to be accepted, to be well thought of. We saw that in the skit this morning with the girls. I just don't feel like people love me. Nobody loves me. Everybody hates me. Guess I'll go eat worms, that kind of thing. And we all have that desire to be loved. So we create these false images to impress others. I mean, look at Facebook, right? You see what people put on Facebook. We put our best on Facebook, right? The best pictures, the best selfies, the best of ourselves we put out there on Facebook. But I've found that when you really get to know people, there's another side back there that they don't put out there. And we create these false images of ourselves. You know, some people don't have an idol out there on the plain of Dura, but they idolize themselves. They look in the mirror, idolize themselves. You know anybody like that? Don't look at the person beside you, by the way. That wouldn't be good right now. Here's the third thing. If I reject the world's idols, people will try to burn me. People will try to burn me. Let's look at verse 8. It says, at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. We talked about those last week. The astrologers, they're people who worship the planets, the stars, and so forth, the astrology. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. If you do the right thing, there's always people who will try to burn you. Jealousy, it's called jealousy. Their peers wanted to take them down. And if you stand on principle, there are people who will attack you. Just be prepared for that. There are people who will attack you. And that's what was going on here. Here's number 4. Doing the right thing always makes some people angry. You know, if you do the right thing, you do the honest thing, you have integrity, you show character, compassion, or any other Christ-like quality, it's going to make some people angry about you. People think, well, if I were just perfect, then everybody would love me and life would be good. Well, wait a minute. Jesus was perfect. They crucified him. Don't forget that. Don't forget that. And they might crucify you. Someone said there are 3 different kinds of people. There are those who are stuck up, there are those who kiss up, and those who are stand up. Nebuchadnezzar, he's stuck up. He's pretty stuck up on himself. He thinks he's God. He thinks the world revolves around him. He's stuck up. The bureaucrats, they're kiss-ups, right? They're kissing up to him. They're doing whatever he wants them to do. They're kiss-ups. You know, beware of the kiss-ups. They flatter you because they want something from you. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're stand-up guys. When everybody else is falling flat on their face and bowing, they're standing up. They're standing up. What kind of person are you? How would you rate yourself at work, at home, at school? Are you a stuck-up? Are you a kiss-up, or are you stand-up? Are you willing to stand up for what you believe in? To stand up. You know, these guys knew that to bow down would break the first 2 of the 10 Commandments. They grew up as children learning the 10 Commandments. The first 2, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make any graven image to worship. And here they are, out on this plain, and God is putting them to the test. He's saying, your ancestors bowed down and worshiped idols, and that was why they were in Babylon in the first place, because of what the children of Israel had done. They had worshiped idols, and God said, because of that, I'm allowing you to be taken off to Babylon. And here's a test. In front of all these people, only 3 people were willing to stand up and say, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. We're not bowing down to these idols. Let's read a couple more verses. Verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, he's giving them a second chance here. Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you? You know, now it's getting serious. Nebuchadnezzar is issuing a personal challenge. It's not just their peers. It's not just the people that were jealous of them. This is now the king saying, hey, if you don't bow down to this image, we're going to throw you into the furnace. What would you do? What would you do if you faced that question? Four things you need to do when the heat is on. Number one, don't defend yourself. Notice what they did in verse 16. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you on this matter. He said, we're not going to defend ourselves. Here's where we stand. Here's where we stand. We're not going to defend ourselves. 1 Peter 2:12 says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. I think it's important for us to just stand and do what we know what is right. That's what these guys were doing. They were just doing what they knew what was right. Not to bow to another idol because God told them not to bow to another idol. The second thing is remember that God is able to save you. Verse 17 says, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hands. Turn to your neighbor and say, he is able. He is able. Believe that God is able to, okay? The God you serve is the same God that parted the waters of the Red Sea, the same God that brought the walls of Jericho down, the same God that rained fire from heaven for Elijah. He's the same God that healed the lame, he healed the blind, he healed the sick, he raised Lazarus from the dead, and he is able to save you. He is able. Whatever fire you're facing right now, God is able to deliver you. But they didn't stop there. The third thing is believe that God will save you. They said, he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. He will deliver us from your majesty's hand. What they were saying was, you don't have control over our lives. If we die in that furnace, it's not because you're doing it, it's because God allowed it to happen, because God is able. He's able to save you. God is able to save you. Maybe if we die in that furnace, it's because God has a bigger purpose here. What they're saying is other people don't have control over you. The king didn't have control over them. They said, he is able to deliver us. You know, with every fiber of their being, these young men believed that God they served would deliver them from the fire. Why? Because they refused to worship Nebuchadnezzar. You're subject to who you worship. You're subject to who you worship. And they worshiped the God of the universe. Whatever crisis you're facing in your life right now, believe that he is able and that he will deliver you. Get familiar with the promises of God, like these promises in Isaiah 43, where he says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were saying, based on these things, we're not worried. We're not afraid. I know what God can do, and I'm expecting him to do it. The fourth thing is announce my loyalty to God no matter what. Look at verse 18. It says, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. That's pretty strong. They said, we believe he's able. We believe that he will. But even if he chooses not to, we will not serve your gods. They knew exactly where they stood. Now notice they were respectful. They called him your majesty. They didn't get all hot and bothered and throw a big protest and try to get people to all stirred up. No, they just said, this is where we stand. This is what we believe in. And hey, it's in God's hands. It's in God's hands. You know, throughout history, Christianity was built on the graves of martyrs. Martyrs who were willing to take a stand for what they believed in. It started with the disciples. All of them but John were killed for their faith. And they tried to kill John. They put him in a pot of boiling oil, and he miraculously was saved. The Romans threw the Christians to the lions in the Colosseums, and the crowds cheered as they were torn to pieces. Well, we don't do that today, but today babies are torn to pieces in the mother's womb with the horror of abortion, and the ruling class cheers. The United States was founded because Christians were fleeing persecution in Europe by the state-run church. Muslims have killed millions of Christians in their 1,400-year history and continue to do so today anywhere they can get by with it. Today, in our neighboring country to the north, in Canada, pastors are getting arrested and put into prison because they refuse to bow to the Fauci-like mandates in their country and close their churches. We have similar situations today where we need to stand up and speak the truth. Not in a controversial way, not in, but just let people know this is where we stand. This is where we stand. Next part, 3 ways God will help in times of crisis. You know, Jesus promised, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Here's the first one. Sometimes God saves us from the crisis. Sometimes God saves us from the crisis. You know, He gives us a divine detour. You know, He could have timed things so that these 3 men were out of town that weekend. You know, most of the divine detours in your life you will never know about. Maybe the enemy has targeted you and for that evil disease, cancer. But God says, not him or not her, not now. And His healing angel heals your body and you don't even know it. You don't even know you were sick. Maybe there's an accident on the road ready to happen and has your name on it. But God says, not today. And somehow He delays you and you're not there when that accident was supposed to happen. He says, my child, I'm protecting you today. Sometimes God saves us from the crisis. Sometimes God saves us through the crisis. You go into the fiery furnace like these men did. He doesn't take you from the problem. He helps you through the problem. The cancer comes, but He gives you supernatural strength to deal with it, or whatever it is that comes into your life, and you have supernatural strength to deal with it. He's with you through the fire, as we sang about this morning. And sometimes, thirdly, sometimes God saves us by the crisis. By the crisis. Sometimes God takes us through it in order to reveal something about ourselves, something in our character that needs to be exposed or eradicated. 1 Peter 1 says this, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. You know, I know many of you here this morning. I know your stories, and I know that you started coming to Solid Rock Chapel because of a crisis in your life. Something happens in your life and you go, I think I should find a church. Some of you, it was because of a divorce, a sickness, a heart attack, losing a parent or spouse. Many times people, because of a crisis in their life, they start looking for God. They start looking for answers. Maybe you just looked at our world and said, our world's really messed up. I need to find a church. And I've heard those stories where people are like, something's wrong out there. And they need to find a church where the truth is spoken. See, God doesn't care so much about your happiness. What he cares about is your character. And if he has to bring some unpleasant things into your life to develop your character, he will. Think about these 3 boys. They had gone through some unpleasant things. They were hauled off to a foreign land. They were instructed in a pagan society. And now they find themselves with a real test where they had to decide, do we bow or do we not? Remember, God is preparing you for eternity. You're in preschool right now. This is just the warm-up act. He's preparing you for eternity. He sees a much bigger picture than we do. Okay, my final section this morning, 5 things God does when I'm in the fire. Look at verse 19. It says, then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the fire so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. How do you make a fire hotter? Well, like I talked about a forge. That's why I think it was some type of a forge where they forced air in there. Makes it hotter and hotter. He said, make it 7 times hotter than normal. Probably 7 times hotter than what they used to melt down the gold. That's hot. And they threw them into the fire. When you're feeling the pressure, you're in the crisis, your situation looks impossible, you feel like you can't go on. You're in the fire, you're in it. Here's number 1. God will walk through the fire with me. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of the gods. Or the Son of God, has some translations. I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar didn't know what the Son of God looked like, but he looked like this was some kind of a being in there, some kind of a person that looked like the Son of God. It was the Son of God. Those times when the heat is on, you feel like you're all alone. There's another in the fire. There's another in the fire. The second thing, God will burn off everything tying me down. He'll burn off everything tying me down. Verse 26. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them as they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. God will burn off everything tying me down. The ropes are gone. They walked out of the fire. Isaiah 48:10 says, see, I've refined you, though not as silver, I've tested you in the furnace of affliction. It's how they refine silver and gold. They heat it up. They heat it up. And it takes all the impurities out. One silversmith was asked, how do you know when it's pure? And he said, when I can see my reflection in the silver, I know it's pure. When God can see his reflection in you, he knows you're pure, purified by fire. Here's a third thing. God will give me a new freedom. The ropes were burned off, but nothing else. When you have been through the fire, you become unshakable. We pastors face attacks from the enemy that you probably can't relate to. We're in a spiritual battle. The enemy doesn't like what we're doing, and they come in many forms. They come in thoughts. They come sometimes in phone calls, emails, doubts, distractions. Those used to trip me up, but not anymore. Satan comes with these attacks, but I know there's someone else in the fire with me, and sometimes when I've learned that when those attacks are the greatest, it's when God is getting ready to do something awesome. God's getting ready to do something awesome, and Satan doesn't like it. And or sometimes when God has just done something awesome, and Satan comes along and he attacks me, he attacks our family, and all this kind of stuff. But there's a new kind of freedom because I know where the attacks come from, and I know how to fight back now. And sometimes, definitely we need your prayers all the time. Please pray for our family, and because Satan does bring those attacks on us on a regular basis. But thank God we've got someone to go through the fire with us, someone to burn those ropes off. Here's a fourth thing. God will use my experiences to draw unbelievers to him. Look at verse 28. Verse 28 says, Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Now, I don't know if I quite agree with Nebuchadnezzar's response. I mean, yeah, it was partly good. He said, hey, we're going to worship their God, but to say anybody that doesn't, we're going to kill them, but that's how people in power do sometimes, right? And but it brought people to follow God. And if we follow this story on through the book of Daniel, we see where there was another king that came on later, and he actually allowed the children of Israel to go back to Israel. And he allowed them to go back to Israel and rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. If you go to the book of Nehemiah, you can read about all that. But God will use my experiences to draw unbelievers to him. And we see that happening when Christians stand up, that other people are drawn to that. They're drawn to that. Here's the fifth thing. God will reward me in eternity. The Apostle Paul said, by the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it, but each one should build with care, for no one can lay any foundation other than one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, their work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light, and it will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. The Apostle Paul, probably the greatest Christian that ever lived, wrote a large portion of the New Testament. But his life wasn't a piece of cake. He went through shipwrecks. He went into prison. He was tortured. He was beaten. He was told not to speak in this name anymore. And yet he kept doing it over and over and over again. And he says, you will be tested, but if it survives, the builder will receive a reward. I just want to ask in closing this morning, what are you feeling this morning? What are you feeling? Are you going through a fire? Are you going through a fire at work, at school, financial, family relationship? Will you make a commitment today that no matter what happens, you will stand? Stand for what's right, like these three Hebrews did. Maybe in your work you're being asked to compromise, to do something that you know is not right. Will you stand? Will you stand like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did? Let's stand as we pray together this morning. Father, we thank you that we have these real examples from your word that teach us how to stand, teach us that the importance of standing, and also teach us that you're with us when we do. We're not by ourselves. You promise to be with us, and you give us real examples of going through the fire with us.